Was it really just a week ago? Everything was going so great. On that lamb selection day, we had paraded into Jerusalem, Jesus riding on a donkey's colt to the songs and praises of the crowd. We smiled until our faces hurt. Jesus was back, and we basked in the glow of popularity once again. And then, the following day, Jesus ripped through the Temple Mount, driving out the money changers and the sacrifice sellers, shouting from Isaiah the prophet of how his house was to be a house of prayer for all nations. Throughout that week, Jesus stood boldly in and around the temple precinct, teaching about the kingdom of God. The Sadducees and the Pharisees, they took turns trying to bait him with their trick questions, and he answered every one with such wisdom and truth that eventually they were so humiliated they corporately fell into a sullen silence. Thursday night was amazing. Late in the afternoon, we stopped by the ceremonial baths near the temple and purified ourselves before walking to the upper city in Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. This first feast of our festival year reminded us of how thousands of years earlier God had delivered his people who had been kept in bondage near Egypt by the power of his mighty hand. What an incredible evening. We followed the Seder through the first 2 cups of wine, and then Jesus began to talk of betrayal. And Judas suddenly left. After the Passover meal was finished, Jesus diverted from the traditional liturgy and used the Passover elements to start something new. We didn't really understand it at the time, but eventually we would. Jesus even washed our feet. After the celebration had ended, we left the house where we were dining and headed out to the Mount of Olives, singing the great Hallel as we walked. After the song, Jesus began to teach as he had done so often. Upon reaching the mountain, we ascended to a private garden area where the olive press was located. It was a favorite spot of Jesus, and when we were in Jerusalem, he often visited it to escape from the crowds, to clear his head and to talk with his Father. Somewhere along the way, his mood had changed. He seemed to be unusually burdened by something we could not perceive. And then our world came crashing down. Judas, one of our own, a friend, a comrade, someone we thought we knew, entered the garden leading an angry, torch-carrying mob accompanied by temple guards, seeking to arrest Jesus. For what? Had Jesus not been right there in the temple courts every day this week, teaching right under their noses? Those cowards were too afraid to do so in the light of day, so they came slithering into the garden under the cover of darkness to carry out their jealous plot. Peter had a feeble effort to resist, but Jesus rebuked him and told him to stop. The rest of us, we were so frightened and confused, we didn't know what to do in the end. Driven by panic and fear, we, who called ourselves his disciples, ran away. We just ran away. Every one of us, leaving Jesus alone in the angry hands of a mob. For the remainder of the night and into the early morning hours of Friday, Jesus was herded in and out of a series of illegal trials, first to the high priest and then to the Sanhedrin, on to Pilate, over to Herod, and back to Pilate. Finally, after trying everything he could to have Jesus acquitted and released, Pilate succumbed to the pressure from the religious leaders and the crowd and ordered that Jesus, whom he had declared innocent earlier, ordered him to be beaten and crucified. Crucified. We'd been with Jesus for 3 years, and when we caught a glimpse of him, we could barely recognize him. He carried his cross beam as far as he could, but being beaten nearly to death, and falling repeatedly under the beam, the impatient Roman soldiers grabbed a man from the crowd of onlookers and forced him to carry Jesus' cross to the foot of Skull Hill. After being nailed to that cross, Jesus would, for 6 grueling hours, slowly, in anguish, die. His lifeless body was taken down from the cross by Joseph and Nicodemus and hurriedly prepared for burial and placed in Joseph's own tomb. Later, after the religious leaders had complained, the Romans sealed the tomb and placed a guard there, like those of us who had run away from Jesus in the garden when he needed us the most would somehow find the courage to steal his lifeless body from his grave. What would even be the point? It was over. Jesus was dead. How could everything go so horribly wrong in such a short span of time? It hadn't even been a whole week.